Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are going to continue our ongoing coverage of Battlefield Earth. We are going to continue to look at the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And we're going to have a brief stop in the ongoing war between the Israelis and Hamas. But first, we're going to stop and we're going to visit the war between Ukraine and Russia. So as we speak, there is a great deal of pressure being applied to both the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian political leadership. And one may think that these are two separate issues. But these are essentially very much the same issue being caused, and this is the important part, by Russian deep battle doctrine. The Russian strategy, especially in terms of the deep battle doctrine, is starting to take a toll on both the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian political apparatus. We are seeing infighting. We are seeing infighting between the political leadership of Zelensky having troubled conversations and troubled interactions with both his key military leadership and his regional governors and governors of large municipalities such as Kiev. And again, this is because of the deep battle doctrine strategy being used by the Russians. I think it's important to have a look at exactly what is the goal and strategy of this deep battle doctrine. The goal of deep battle operations is to inflict decisive strategic defeat on the enemy's logistical abilities and render the defense of their front more difficult or impossible. Unlike most other doctrines, deep battle doctrine stressed combined arms operation at all levels: strategic, operational, tactical, and political. And again, we're starting to see the relationship between the Ukrainian military and the high command of the Ukrainian military start to fracture from the political leadership in Kiev, meaning pertaining directly to Zelensky. And again, as I've already mentioned, there's also friction going on between municipal and regional leaders as well. There is the odor of authoritarianism being propagated by the Zelensky regime. And again, this is in part because of the execution of this deep battle doctrine. What is happening right now, in Ukraine is being caused with intent. The breakdown of the relationship here in the United States, in which the U.S. does not want to write the Ukrainians a blank check. And then obviously the handing over of continued military supplies to the Ukrainians. I think at this point, the Ukrainians, Zelensky, is more concerned about the loss of the infusion of continued capital than he is about actual military supplies. Obviously, if he doesn't get military supplies, that is going to lead to further battlefield defeats. Now, he is able to continue defensive operations with the forces he has on hand and the forces that his European allies are still handing over. But the lack of what the United States is going to eventually provide is also going to start to have a deep effect in terms of what the Ukrainians are able to do. Now, we are starting to see, and we have been seeing over the last several days, the Russians starting to use more and more of these very large air-launched glide munitions. We're now seeing the Russians daily, each day, hit up to 100 aim points with 500-pound or 2,000-pound glide bombs. Now, even if, let's say, 100 aim points are targeted by these air-launched munitions, and let's say that only 10%, 10 aim points result in casualties ranging from 4 to 25 Ukrainian soldiers. That is still a significant amount of loss of life and materiel on a daily basis. And the Russians are starting to use those systems more and more on a daily basis. And it is having an impact on both the front line and deep in the rear areas of Ukraine. So that's continuing to happen. Now, we're not seeing the Russians deploy as many of their attack helicopters, their gunships, in a direct air-to-ground role. That is reducing because of the threat of Ukrainian air defense systems. But again, we're starting to see an increase in actual fixed-wing fast movers, i.e. Su-34s, Su-24s, Su-25s, Su-30s, Su-35s, dropping these larger bombs, these larger glide bombs on Ukrainian forces. It is absolutely, without a doubt, having an impact on what's happening on the battlefield. Without a doubt. And that's only going to increase as Russia ramps up, as we've talked about this before, its military-industrial complex. Its ability to manufacture or take what were essentially dumb bombs, unguided ordnance, put glide packages, put wings on those bombs, put a GLONASS receiver on those bombs, and turn them into precision-guided or fairly precision-guided weapon systems. And again, they're going to be used more and more. Right now we're seeing essentially 100 aim points being hit per day. That will probably increase. We're already starting to see the Russians go from launching one bomb on one aircraft to launching 4 to 6 of these bombs per aircraft. We're also seeing the sortie package of the Russians increase as well. So you have this fixed front line that's not moving. The Russians can see and identify Ukrainian forces, such as what's happening on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. If we go and we look at this area, the area near Krinky, all this is now the gray zone. This gray zone means that it's contested. There's ongoing battles by Russian forces. The Russians have moved a new airborne division into this area, and those forces are engaging Ukrainian forces on the ground. It's become more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to move supplies and reinforcements across the Dnieper River because of both Russian drones and the Russian ability to launch these long-range glide bombs against Ukrainian forces. Very precarious situation right now for Ukrainian forces that are essentially trapped in Krinky, this area here. We don't believe that Ukrainian forces are going to be able to maintain an operational deployment in this area for the rest of winter. At a certain point, these forces we believe, are going to surrender, or somehow they're going to try to get back across the Dnieper River and get back onto the west bank of the Dnieper River. Incredibly difficult situation right now, and obviously the Ukrainians are not in any position to conduct offensive operations against the Russians in this area. Again, buildup of Russian forces and the continued use of these very large glide bombs that are being used. I think just in the Krinky region alone, up to 20 plus glide bombs were used against Ukrainian forces, both on the eastern bank and the western bank. And again, this is happening daily. This pressure is being exerted daily by the Russians against the Ukrainians. We can say at this point the Russians have launched fairly large-scale offensive operations, both in areas near Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and to the north towards Kupiansk. These operations, these high-pressure, high-tempo operations, both aerial in nature and with the presence of ground assault teams, continue. Very difficult situation for the Ukrainians. I think at this point, the Ukrainian military high command is starting to acknowledge that right now they are at best in a stalemate with Russian forces in terms of being able to defend current areas that the Ukrainians control. But I think it's worse than that. I think the Ukrainians right now are on the precipice, probably someplace within winter, post-winter, of possibly seeing the collapse, the general collapse of some of their frontline formations. It's just what's happening on the battlefield. And I know, obviously, if you're a Ukrainian supporter, it's something that you want to hear. Obviously, in terms of Zelensky, what he is trying to articulate is that he believes that the Ukrainians will eventually be able to launch renewed offensive operations against the Russians. And the problem with that is Zelensky is not in a position, nor does he have the knowledge base to predict that. So again, you have this fracture between the Ukrainian military and the political leadership in Kiev. Now let's just face it. Prior to becoming president of Ukraine, Zelensky was an actor. He played the part of the president of Ukraine and other roles in terms of Eastern Europe Hollywood. Some would ask and some would argue, is he even qualified? Is Zelensky even qualified to be president of Ukraine? Probably not, especially a wartime president who's making political decisions based on Western opinion versus what his military leadership is trying to tell him. His military leadership right now is attempting to say, hey, time out, we're not going to win this. Unless there's some sort of paradigm shift in terms of the Ukrainians suddenly getting an air force that can compete against the Russians over the airspace over Ukraine and eastern Russia. It's not going to happen. So that's where they sit. Now, I wanted to touch base on the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. Now, there has been continued discussion about the initial success of the Hamas operation, where it crossed into Israel and did horrific, barbaric acts of cruelty against citizens of Israel. That is undeniable. It cannot be denied. Horrible. Now, at the same time, we have also seen reports that Hamas had taken control of Israeli military bases and had, quote-unquote, seized control or destroyed, captured or destroyed over 100 Israeli armored vehicles. And we wanted to clarify that. We wanted to clarify exactly what Hamas was showing in terms of Israeli armored vehicles, quote-unquote, captured. And we wanted to give you, the viewer, insight into what exactly happened in terms of those specific Israeli armored vehicles. Now, yes, we have seen Hamas fighters, as Israeli forces continue to press the offensive in Gaza. And again, make no mistake. Please make no mistake. Hamas is going to be destroyed. That is going to happen. Now, at what cost to the Israelis? Again, difficult to say at this point. Yes, we have seen Hamas have the capability of destroying individual Israeli armored vehicles. We have seen heavy Israeli APCs, essentially mobile APCs designed around tank platforms, heavy main battle tank platforms, be destroyed by Hamas IEDs, explosively formed penetrators, anti-tank guided weapon systems, mines, what have you. We've seen that happen. But specifically, we wanted to address what happened in Nahal Oz, this locale here. So Hamas fighters were able to obviously cross the security zone from Gaza into Israel proper. And what we have seen on video is, or video footage, is of Hamas fighters occupying this motor pool right here. And that is being articulated as Hamas fighters captured dozens of Israeli armored vehicles. So what actually happened? What occurred here? Well, Hamas fighters did occupy this Israeli mechanized armored battalion motor pool, very close to the border with Gaza. There were very few soldiers on duty at the time, given the fact that it was a holiday, and Hamas fighters on foot and in wheeled technical type vehicles, Toyotas, what have you, were able to enter this facility and give the perception that they had, quote-unquote, captured Israeli armored vehicles. Now, did Hamas capture Israeli armored vehicles? No, they did not. They occupied the motor pools. That cannot be denied. And they occupied those motor pools for a very short period of time before Israeli drones and helicopter gunships forced those Hamas fighters into the shelters, into the buildings of this Israeli military base. And it's not a huge military base by any stretch of the imagination. It's, again, essentially a battalion-sized element operated this this forward outpost of the Israeli military. The videos that you see are obviously of Hamas fighters walking around this motor pool, and you can see some of these heavy Israeli APCs. You can even see Merkava main battle tanks in the motor pool that were quote-unquote captured. But were they captured? No, they were not captured. Hamas fighters were present. They may have even destroyed a few of these vehicles. But at the end of the day, they weren't able to spend a significant amount of time at this military base before they were destroyed by Israeli forces. Eventually, Israeli Special Operations Forces landed via helicopter and engaged those Hamas fighters on the ground. And then obviously, the Israeli Air Force was able to rid themselves of these Hamas fighters that had briefly taken control of this military base. So when they say that Hamas had captured or destroyed 100 Israeli armored vehicles, again, I think that's a false narrative. The reality is they occupied a base for a very short period of time in which there were Israeli armored vehicles present. Now, we don't think most of those armored vehicles were actually destroyed. None of those armored vehicles were taken by Hamas into the Gaza Strip and then used against the Israelis. That did not happen. The Hamas fighters were eventually pushed out, and Israeli forces reclaimed those armored vehicles that at one point in time Hamas had declared that they had quote-unquote captured. The reality is they did not capture those armored vehicles. Didn't happen. So we are continuing to see the war continue. Obviously, very, very intense urban battles are taking place. There's losses on both sides. The Israelis are being incredibly patient in terms of how they are deploying against these Hamas fighters. Have the Israelis taken casualties? Yes, absolutely. I think we're up to just under 100 Israeli KIA'd in the ongoing battles that are taking place in this vast and dense urban environment. But the Israelis are being incredibly innovative in terms of how they are fighting Hamas in these neighborhoods. And again, it is a slow process, but a process that we believe here at MFAM, the Israelis will eventually be victorious. And Hamas will, in fact, be defeated on the battlefield and ultimately will not be a political entity in the Gaza Strip. I believe at this point we are going to see Israeli forces reconquer the Gaza Strip. Now, what will that look like a year from now? Difficult to say. I think it'll be some sort of puppet institution that the Israeli military installs in the Gaza Strip. It'll have a Palestinian face, but ultimately the Israelis will be in control. That's what will happen. So we will continue to report. We will continue to create content for your consumption. Thank you for joining us. And as always, have a good day.